Yesterday, Vivek Ramaswamy sent waves over the internet with a controversial explanation of why, quote, top tech companies often hire foreign-born or first-generation engineers over Native Americans. Ramaswamy is the self-made billionaire entrepreneur turned presidential candidate and now tapped by President-elect Trump to co-lead the Department of Government Efficiency along with Elon Musk. Ramaswamy went on to say, quote, our American culture has venerated mediocrity over excellence for way too long, at least since the 90s and likely longer. That doesn't start in college, it starts young. Joining us to discuss education and youth culture is Alex Newman, award-winning international journalist, educator, and author. Alex, welcome to Newsroom. Thanks for joining.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
So Alex, Ramaswamy's X post went viral, receiving over 70 million views at last check. It might be higher now. What do you think the post, why did it receive so much attention?
Well, I think partly because it was so controversial. Obviously, all of what he said was said in the context of immigration, which is already a lightning rod when it comes to controversy. And I think if we're honest, there's a very significant element of truth in what he said. I wouldn't say that is American culture per se, but I actually outlined this in a column series that I did for the Epoch Times that eventually became the book Indoctrinating Our Children to Death, which has been endorsed by multiple members of the incoming administration. There has been a deliberate program to dumb down and indoctrinate young people in America, and it goes back multiple generations, and we're seeing the fruit of that. But at the same time, I think Vivek would have done well to recognize that is not applicable to all of the young people in America today. In fact, when I met Vivek Ramaswamy, he and I spoke at an event at Camp Constitution in New Hampshire when he was on the campaign trail, and I interviewed him there. It was actually an event for young people. There were hundreds of young people there, primarily home educated, who were very intelligent, very hardworking, and totally defy the stereotype that Vivek presented of American young people and American culture. So I think it would have been good to acknowledge that, but I can see why this is getting so much attention. And it's a lightning rod of an issue, and I think he just stepped into a political minefield.
Now, Alex, you mentioned the dumbing down of America and how you've covered this at length. There's a study called the Program for International Students Assessment, or PISA, which is conducted every 3 years. In that study from 2022, the U.S. ranks 6th in reading, 10th in science, though 28th in math. You mentioned the dumbing down of America. How would you analyze the current state of U.S. education?
To call it a dumpster fire, I think would be much too kind. And I don't say that to be insulting. I don't say that as an insult to the many hardworking teachers who are in the system. But the problem is now we have a system that was designed by people who had very nefarious intentions on the far left wing of the spectrum, including actual communists, aficionados of the Soviet Union, and then super capitalists who were much more interested in having worker drones capable of working in a factory but not thinking. And so this system has carried over, and it has continued to dumb down the American population. And you can verify this using multiple objective measures. PISA, I would argue, is one of the less valuable ones, precisely because it is put out by ideological people over at the Organization for Economic Development and Cooperation, the OECD. But if you look at, for example, SAT scores, if you look at reading, if you look at our writing abilities, ACT scores, any measure you use to look at where Americans are at today educationally shows that we have seen an unbelievable decline. And this decline is continuing, it's accelerating. And so Vivek has a point. If we don't get this under control, if we don't stop this, and it's not just a culture of mediocrity, it is an agenda that is deliberately miseducating our children. It's true. There will be no chance for American workers to compete in a global economy. But these are problems that have relatively simple solutions. These are things that Trump can play a big role fixing, state governments can play a big role fixing, and especially parents can play a big role fixing. So it's not inevitable that this has to continue. It can be turned around. And I don't believe, like Vivek does, that the solution is bringing in a bunch of foreigners who don't necessarily share American values.
Now, I want to come back to your point about Marxist infiltration potentially, but in his tweet or X post, one of the responses said that, America built the aerospace sector and asked, then why does everyone want to come here? To which Ramaswamy responded by saying that the version of America that used to embody unbridled exceptionalism is exactly what we want to return to. And that's a point about culture, not immigration policy. So do you agree with Ramaswamy that America's parents and youth has a culture that doesn't celebrate educational excellence?
I think he's right to an extent, but I think there's an added caveat here that is really essential to understand. And that is the old cliche about politics being downstream from culture is absolutely true. Andrew Breitbart used to say that a lot, but I would take it one step further. I would say that culture is downstream from education. What has happened in this country, and I documented this very extensively in my series for the Epic Times and later in my book, Indoctrinating Our Children to Death, there has been a deliberate agenda that is provable. We have smoking gun evidence, primary source documents proving that there was an agenda to dumb down the American people, to create this so-called culture of mediocrity. That was a design of the system. It wasn't a flaw. It was designed into it. And again, this is something that can be documented. It can be proven. There are lawsuits going on about this as we speak in Massachusetts and other places. So it's not that American culture has degenerated on its own through some mysterious force of nature or lazy parents. This has been a deliberate agenda by people with nefarious intentions who have names, who wrote extensively about what they were doing. And the obvious one is John Dewey, right? Every educator in America knows John Dewey. He's often called the founding father of America's public school system. What they don't teach these educators in their colleges of education is that he was a big fan of the Soviet Union, that he was a founder of a new religion called humanism, that actually, if you read it without the kind of nice terminology, is really just Marxism repackaged. So when you add that element into it and you realize that this guy was working with other people who believed, as he did, that education was the way to bring about these societal changes, you realize there's a deliberate agenda at work here. It can be reversed. It must be reversed. But to restore culture is going to necessarily have to run through education.
So I want to jump deeper into it now. It's very provocative, of course. Now, a survey conducted a few years ago showed that 1/3 of Gen Z hold a favorable view of Marxism, I presume very much related to what you were just sharing. That worldview has led to nearly 10 times the amount of deaths than did the Holocaust. So why do the youth hold a favorable view of Marxism? And what does that say about the youth culture and education?
I think the primary reason we see this is ignorance and a deliberate agenda to indoctrinate children. And you see this very clearly. When children are learning history, you would think that the history of communism would be something important for them to learn. This was an ideology and a criminal conspiracy, if you will, responsible for the slaughter of hundreds of millions of people, the enslavement of billions more. China today is still under the boot of a communist party. Cuba, just 90 miles off our shore, is under the boot of a communist party. But the problem is, our young people don't know anything about this. When you look into the details of those surveys, they're even more troubling. Among my generation, millennials, 70% say they will vote for socialists in the future. These are scientific polls. The reason for this is very clear. These young people have been indoctrinated. They don't know the first thing about history. They don't know the first thing about economics. They don't know the first thing about how to properly pursue truth or come up with a logical argument. And so in those circumstances, it becomes very easy to fall for the pathetic propaganda of totalitarians. And that's the situation we find ourselves in right now as a nation. It is an existential threat to our country, far beyond tech jobs and H-1B visas.
Now, you mentioned that there's smoking gun evidence. Can you share a couple of examples that are very easy to grasp of how this has been done intentionally, as you say?
Yeah, so what I do in the book, actually, and in the series for the Epic Times, we start at the beginning with the first guy to seriously propose that the government ought to educate people's children. And if you ask a well-informed person today who proposed that the government ought to educate our children, people will instinctively say, well, that was Karl Marx in the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto. But it wasn't. Even before Karl Marx, we had a guy called Robert Owen, who was a communist, such a devoted communist. He started a commune in Indiana called New Harmony in the early 1800s. And he launched the movement to have government take over education for the specific purpose, according to one of his cohorts, of undermining Christianity and the Christian principles that led to the free society we know as the United States of America. Fast forward to Horace Mann. That system actually took root in Prussia. And there's a very interesting story of how his ideas got to Prussia, but they took root in Prussia. Horace Mann, who then brought those ideas back to Massachusetts, became the first ever Secretary of Education in the United States, in any state. He was the Secretary of Education for Massachusetts. And right away, the quackery, the dumbing down came rushing in. And then over a period of about 50 years, he traveled across the United States, spread this idea that the government ought to educate children. More and more states jumped on board. And that's when John Dewey, in partnership with John D. Rockefeller and Frederick Gates, who was running Rockefeller's Education Foundation, came together and decided to take over this system weaponize it. And you can read John Dewey's own writings. I encourage people to start with the Humanist Manifesto, which was the religious document he came up with. Their agenda was very clear. Get rid of God, get rid of private property, get rid of the profit motive, and radically restructure society. And of course, education, as Dewey said over and over again, was the primary mechanism for bringing that about. And so then you look at some of the big educational reforms that he brought in. For example, the whole word, look, say, cite method of teaching reading. This was first exposed as quackery in the 1840s under the leadership of Horace Mann in Boston. And yet John Dewey, with Rockefeller funding, resurrected this, knowing full well what it would do because he had tried it out in his experimental school at the University of Chicago. So this is just the tip of the iceberg. I encourage people to look into the evidence for this. It's overwhelming. It's indisputable. I have not had one person challenge the facts that I have presented. And it is, as I mentioned before, an existential threat to the future of our country.
Alex, I have like 10 more questions for you, but unfortunately we've run out of time, so we'll have to have you back again because there's just so much to unpack here. Really appreciate you joining. Alex Newman, award-winning international journalist, educator, and author. Have a great new year.
Thank you so much, you too.